I'm Shahar Azani, and in the news, Israel's decision to compensate Yemenite, Mizrachi and Balkan families for the kidnapping of the children of Yemen, Yalde Teman. On February 22, 2021, the Israeli government approved a proposal for the state to recognize Yemenite, Mizrachi and Balkan children affair and the transfer of financial compensation to the families that were hurt in the early years of the State of Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated, "This is among the most painful affairs in the history of the State of Israel. The time has come for the families whose infants were taken from them to receive recognition by the state and government of Israel and financial compensation as well. The compensation will not atone for the terrible suffering that the families went through." The Prime Minister added that he would ask the Education Minister of the State of Israel to include the Yemenite children affair in the textbooks of Israeli school children. So, are we finally seeing the end of this painful issue of Yalde Teman? What is this new arrangements for compensation, and is it enough? With me to answer some of these pressing questions and discuss this and more is my good friend Sampson Giat, all the way from Florida. A few words about Sampson. Sampson Giat was a lifelong professional musician, performing in many symphony orchestras, including the Israel Philharmonic, at the invitation of the conductor Zubin Mehta. Sampson Giat was elected by the Yemenite community as president of the Yemenite Jewish Federation of America. In that capacity, he had discovered and brought together through DNA a mother who had not seen her child in 49 years. He also served as president of Volunteers for Israel, being responsible for 8 offices around the US. By the end of his term, more than 140,000 civilians have volunteered to do civilian maintenance work on Israeli IDF bases. In 1992, Mr. Giat traveled to Yemen to encourage the remaining Jews to emigrate to Israel. This week, he celebrated his 90th birthday, Mazel Tov, and wrote a memoir named My Memoir as an activist for Israel and Yemenite Jews. Mr. Giat, such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Shahar, thank you so much for the invitation and for the introduction. I would like to answer your questions.
But before we begin, I just want to say it's a pleasure to have you with us today on JBS, and maybe start off with a question. Let me point you in the right direction of how did you get involved in Yalde Teman? Maybe you can share some of the background to this painful story that not too many people actually know about.
Happily. First, I will give you a little background before I answer that question of the issue of Yalde Teman. I will read a couple of short paragraphs from my book that would help. Upon arriving in Israel from Yemen, many immigrant families suffered a loss of one or more children under suspicious circumstances. These families relate similar stories. Their child was brought to the sanitary children's house where they slept in the Ma'abara, which is a transit camp. The mothers went there to breastfeed their children. After a period of time, the family was informed that their child had died. The families were never given a death certificate for the child, nor were the families shown a body or a grave. To kidnap over 1,000 Yemenites at will is to dehumanize a segment of Israel's countrymen. Didn't the authorities feel the pain of the parents? What Zionist ideology gave them the right not to return babies to their biological parents from the clinics and hospitals? To say that there was confusion in those days is the lamest of excuses. There were professional doctors, nurses, sanitary children's quarters, and records of every tent, blanket, bed, dishes, and utensils. Could they lose a human being so easily? I later discovered how that happened. In 1949, Israel was a socialist country, and kibbutzim were very, very important for the economy. Many political parties controlled various kibbutzim. Here's some testimony from a government official whose name is Avigdor Pe'er. Mr. Avigdor Pe'er was a former assistant director of the Division for Aid to Immigration of the Ministry of Social Welfare. He broke 30 years of silence by informing the Knesset Interior Committee on November 27, 1985, that on his watch, tens of hundreds, and this is a quote, tens of hundreds of babies were taken from baby shelters in absorption camps. They were also taken from hospitals and clinics and given to 4 women's organizations, Working Mothers of Mapai, Aguda Women, Amuna Women, that's the NRP, and the General Zionist Women's Organization. The Mapai, being the largest organization, received the greatest number of children according to party distribution. These political parties needed the children for the future to populate the kibbutzim that their party controlled. And obviously, these babies were adopted by the people that lived on these kibbutzim. Now he says, tens of hundreds of babies were taken from baby shelters. Now these are his words, not my words. What did the Knesset do about this when they heard from him? Nothing.
What did they do? What did they do, Sampson?
They did absolutely nothing. Another man, Abraham Steinberg, published a book in 1973 titled A People is Absorbed. On page 76, he wrote, the late Dr. Israeli was in charge of the Southern District for Medical Services of New Immigrants. Now listen to this, Shahar. Quote, he transferred tens of hundreds of children from the hospital to the World Zionist Organization's children's home in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Tzfat. Quote, often the children stayed there for many months. Ambulances were used with nurses accompanying them. World Zionist Organization institutions was constantly filled with many Yemenite children, close quote. Now, how dare they take these babies away from their biological parents? True, in 1949, Yemenite Jews literally came out of the 12th century. They did not know Western ways. And when a doctor comes to you in a white smock and tells you that your baby died, they believed him.
Let me ask you something. Let me just ask you. You were born here in the United States, correct?
Yes.
How did you get involved in this terrible story?
There were government committees investigating the disappearance of the Yemenite babies. While I was president of the Yemenite Jewish Federation in New York, the third committee, which was called the Cohen Committee, later called the Kedma Committee, called me in New York asking me to help them find kidnapped children in the United States. At that time, our organization was part of the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. I asked so many leaders of these 53 organizations belonging to the Conference of Presidents for help. I told them the story of the kidnappings. Most of them were in tears, but they wouldn't help because they saw this as negativism to Israel. However, the Chabad group, who are lovers of Israel, gave me a platform, and on their TV station, they allowed me to speak about Yalde Teman. And on the screen, during that interview, I put my office number. I got a call about the issue of Yalde Teman. Let me rephrase that. After speaking about the kidnappings of the children, there was a lady in Sacramento, California, who felt that she was one of these kidnapped children. This program was aired in New York at 9:30 a.m., which made it 6:30 a.m. in Sacramento. She was a woman that couldn't sleep that evening because she, as she said to me, she has no idea who she is. She has no idea who her biological parents are. She's originally from Israel, and she was adopted in Israel by Polish parents who lived on a kibbutz called Ein HaMifratz, which is north of Haifa. Later in her life, she met an American and married and moved to Sacramento. I asked her for a photograph and a Tudat Zeut, which is identity card, and anything involving with her parents' adoption of her. And then I went around Israel interviewing attorneys who would take on our case pro bono because the Federation didn't have the money for that. I found a lawyer who would do the work. We brought Sila to Israel. She was interviewed on the 6 o'clock news. And there was a family in Amidar, outside of Bnei Brak, who saw the TV interview, and the mother's name was Margalit Omesi. And Mrs. Omesi felt that Zila, for sure, was her daughter. She's been looking for her for 49 years. She never gave up her daughter for adoption. So she called the TV station, asked us to remain there, and she was coming down with her other children, which she did. We remained there and we met her, and for sure she felt that Sila was her daughter. However, I advised them that you're never going to know for sure until we did a DNA. The head of the geneticists of the Hebrew University offered to do a DNA for free, and he took specimens from the whole family, from the mother, the brother, and the two sisters, and Sila, and found that Sila was in fact 99.143% the daughter of Margalit Omesi.
Wow, I have to stop you there.
After 49.
Samson, tell me something here. First of all, we can learn about the power of mass media because you got to Tzila through that Chabad broadcast when you shared your contact details. And then you get to Israel, and through the TV and the news, you get to Margalit Omesi at the Amidar neighborhood on the outskirts of, between Bnei Brak and Ramat Gan. Let me ask you, what made Margalit think to begin with that Tzila might be her daughter? Even before the DNA, what made her think that this woman she had never seen is her daughter?
She had another daughter. I believe her name was Rebecca, looked exactly like Tzila. Tzila had a habit of stroking her hair on the right side of her cheek. The daughter did the exact same thing when she was nervous.
That's amazing.
But of course, that doesn't make them sisters. However, Margalit never stopped looking for her daughter. And she made it clear to us and to everyone. She never gave Tzila up for adoption as a child. Tzila was taken from the children's quarters in Rosh Ayin and sent to a hospital in Haifa. The pediatrician there and his wife, who is a nurse, both worked for this hospital called Rambam. They had many babies in their apartment, in their house. And this is where Tzila's adoptive parents found her. And they had a choice of many babies. Now the question is, what are these babies doing in the doctor's home?
Samson, Samson, you were mentioning in your story about Margalit the fact that the DNA was taken not only from the mother, but also from the siblings, from the brother and the sisters. How involved were the siblings of these missing, kidnapped children in this affair? We understand, of course, the parents were incredibly influenced by it, of course, the mothers. How involved are the children to this very day, those brothers and sisters?
Very much so. They were very happy to meet their sibling. They knew all their lives that they had another sibling. They didn't know where she was or whatever happened to her. They knew that the mother was looking for her. As so many other mothers, I could tell you stories of mothers that I interviewed that carry their babies' hats with them. One of them told me she spends the day in the bus station looking at people going by, still looking for her child. Another one tells about walking the streets of Tel Aviv, still looking for their child.
I'm wondering, how are you feeling about the, you have a long history of civil service community leadership, both here in the United States, within the Yemenite Jewish American community, and for Israel. I want to ask you, Samson, first of all, how does that make you feel? And second of all, what do you think about the decision of the government from last week about the compensation?
Well, okay, I'll answer your second question first. We have, as far as the compensation is concerned, we have never, ever asked the government, and we had many, many court appearances with our committees. We have never asked the government for any compensation or reparations. We have only asked the government to recognize the treatment by the former governments of the reprehensible treatment of Yemenite Jews during their Aliyah of 1949. We had never asked for reparations. I have no doubt that some needy families would accept the offer. But as a whole, I know that our organization has never asked for any reparations. I cannot tell you whether these people are correct or not. It's not for me to say. I didn't lose a sibling. However, to answer your first question, after interviewing these mothers that lost children, their cries and their tears never left me. For 35 years, it remained with me. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's something that I remember from my own mother. But when Yemenite women cry, it's a unique kind of cry that goes to your soul. And you just never forget it. The Israeli government hasn't a clue as to how many Yemenite families they've destroyed by kidnapping these babies. Now, there are people in Israel who claim that this never happened. Kidnappings never happened. But what else could you call it? Let the government prove that the families did not put up their children for adoption. What else could it be but kidnap?
Do you think, Sampson, that this decision by the government takes us one step closer to a solution? What do you think about the trajectory of how to deal with this moving forward?
Well, personally, I'm getting up in years. I would love to see an end of this before my time goes. The money that the government offers, of course, could never bring back the children. What I would like to see is, because Israel is a democratic country, and as a democratic country, they can survive bad news. I would like to see the Israeli government formally apologize to the Yemenite community for their poor treatment of Yemenite Jews who could have been their greatest citizens. Because remember, Yemenite Jews emigrating to Israel was their redemption, was their return to Zion. Yemenite Jews knew that they originally came from Jerusalem, the time of the Romans, or even before then. So this is their return to their homeland. No other group has emigrated to Israel with such exuberance as Yemenite Jews. And they were treated horrifically. And there's no reason for that. Yemenite Jews are very, very proud of their heritage.
And I want to stress again, Sampson, that you say this as somebody who loves Israel very much, who dedicated his life for the support of Israel, who headed the Machal organization here to encourage volunteers to go to Israel. And yet you say this with so much pain.
Well, Israel has given solace to Yemenite Jews. Yemen is not a place for Jews to live. There's nothing there for them. There are no schools, there's no universities, there's no doctors, there's no lawyers. There's nothing in Yemen for them. The only thing that the Yemenite Jews had in Yemen was the study of Torah. There isn't a Yemenite Jew that you would meet here in the United States that couldn't go up to the Torah and read directly from the Torah.
Sampson.
My father knew chapters and chapters by memory of Torah. He taught me my Haftorah by memory.
Yeah. I want to, Sampson, I just want to take a moment and thank you for joining us on JBS. I know our time is unfortunately short, but this is just the beginning. At least we were able to share some of it, and they very much listen to what is not an easy experience for you. So thank you for taking the time to share with us your thoughts, your prayers, your experiences. It is truly highly appreciated.
Well, thank you, Shahar, for the opportunity to do this. I know Americans know nothing about the issue of Yalde Teman, about the disappearance of Yemenite children. Everyone in Israel is familiar with it, but in the United States, no one knows about it. I was always hoping, because of being an American, to put pressure on the Israeli government to come forward. I had a lot of help with other issues,
right?
With other Yemenite issues, as when I traveled to Yemen, I had a lot of help from senators, but that's another story.
Well, indeed. I just want to thank you so much, Sampson, for joining us on JBS. This was a very important conversation to have, and I look forward to having this with you again soon. I want to thank you for your passion and for your service for the Yemenite community, Yemenite Jewish community, for Israel and for the Jewish people. This is not an easy topic to contend with in general. When it comes to the state of Israel, like many other states around the world, it is a wonderful and a realization of a dream, but it is far from being perfect. And when we acknowledge some darker parts in our history, it is important that we come at it with sincerity and compassion to learn the lessons of the past and to create a better future for all of us as a Jewish people in the Jewish homeland. I'd like to thank all of our viewers for joining us and tell you stay safe and stay healthy. I'd like to thank our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's managing director, Dara Golub, our technical manager, Michael Paley, transmission manager, John McDevitt, and to our wonderful producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. For JBS, I'm Shahar Azani. Until next time, see you soon. Shalom and lehitraot.